everyone, this is an interesting article of the Financial Post being submitted by Philip Cross. Like I've said many times in the past, folks, there are some of those who represent the private sector, those who haven't cozied up for government funding, such as many of the publications from Post Media, who are offering you alternative perspectives, opinions, and narratives that challenge the establishment or the status quo. Yeah, sure, they don't have public sector funding to the tune of $1 billion plus, such as the CBC, or those who are now cozying up and carrying favor for the ruling establishment because they're getting part of that $600 million bailout package offered them by the federal Liberals under Justin Trudeau. But make no mistake about it, there is still a representation of alternative voices out there, even in the media landscape that has had dominance and influence prior to digital disruptors, such as social media platforms. And if you want them to continue going forward, the onus is on you, the responsibility is on you to support and sustain them financially. Because really, at the end of the day, that's the thing. We don't have the ability, those of us that function in the private market or in the free market, we don't have that representation of force or violence as our ultimate means to the end, or forced wealth and income redistribution. We rely on voluntary donations or economic transactions to sustain us. And Post Media and those who represent it have been wise enough to transition to the digital media era without looking for government handouts. So let's show our appreciation by supporting them voluntarily. Headline of the Financial Post, Philip Cross, the anti-fascist left were the real fascists all along. Oh, music to my ears. You're preaching to the choir. Conflating conservatism with extremism is a sophomoric error by those who don't understand fascism's place on the political spectrum. It's being reported on May 31st, 2019. It is fashionable among the radical left to demonize the growing number of elected conservative governments in the Western world as the rise of the extreme or alt-right. This is most pronounced in the anti-fascist Antifa movement, particularly on university campuses. However, the anti-fascist movement has a sophomoric misunderstanding of fascism and its location on the political spectrum. More disturbing, this lack of understanding extends to its own social media and even physical tactics that mimic the mob psychology, street rage, and bullying that are hallmarks of the fascism they denounce. Projecting, right? It's called misdirection, folks. Recognize and realize. Fascism is best thought of as a nationalistic version of socialism, embodied in Hitler's National Socialist Party, which was shortened to the Nazis. Fascist governments like those of Hitler and Italy's Benito Mussolini, and to some degree Spain's Francisco Franco, in mid-20th century Europe believed in totalitarian control of the economy and oppressive state curtailment of individual liberty. Those are the antithesis of conservative principles. Fascism subsumes all ideology to the goals of the state and the needs for state surveillance. The extreme version of conservatism isn't fascism, as the left wants us to think. It's libertarianism. Everyone wants to join us over there in that realm of liberty, right? That's the thing. Whether they come from the left or the right, trust me, they're all going to come to the same realization at some point in time is libertarianism. Libertarians, yeah, that's where it's at if you care about individual rights, freedoms, and liberty. But it's always nice to have further acknowledgement and recognition of that reality. Instead of left and right or liberal versus conservative, a better scheme is to locate movements on a spectrum that runs from tyranny to liberty. Ah, yes, the four quadrants on the political spectrum: authoritarianism, libertarianism, the left, and the right. And where you align politically or ideologically in those four quadrants speaks volumes as to who you are and your character and how much you have as far as that live and live mentality and respecting people's own sovereignty. Fascism embodies many elements of the socialist state control of society. For libertarian icon Friedrich Hayek, Hitler's National Socialism was indeed socialist in concept and execution, while H. Pierre Secher, biographer of one of Austria's leading socialists, Bruno Kreisky, wrote of the striking similarities between the leftists and the fascists in that country. Ideologically, the distinction between the Sozis, socialists, and commies on the one hand and Nazis on the other was probably only the internationalism of the Marxists and the nationalism of the Nazis. In every other respect, they agreed on the evils of capitalism. The connection of Jews with capitalism helped fuel the anti-Semitism of the Nazis. So true. And I'm so glad to see someone from a mainstream publication pointing this kind of reality out. Thanks for doing so. Mussolini's claim that in a fascist regime there was to be everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state, is of course the totalitarian opposite of the libertarian ideal. Mussolini was long involved with the socialist movement in Italy, breaking with it because of personal ambition and because his socialist brethren would not support Italy's entry into the First World War. Once in power, he inaugurated a major extension of welfare spending and public works projects. Mussolini's insistence that his fascist deputies take seats on the far right of the Italian Constituent Assembly may have led some observers to wrongly conclude that fascism was right-wing. Students have been drawn to the appeal of totalitarian certitude long before political correctness and the Antifa movements arrived on campuses. When the conservative sociologist Peter Berger, whose family fled Austria from the Nazis, found himself in the midst of a violent left-wing anti-war demonstration in the 1960s, he said it reminded him of the stormtroopers that marched through my childhood, with student protesters adopting from fascists their anti-intellectualism, their anger, their street theater, their glorification of youth, or their mysticism. There was also their mob psychology and the militant anti-reason imperviousness to argument. These characteristics are all amply evident in today's campus protests against a fascism they hotly denounce, but whose tactics they generously employ. Off campus, the triumph of religious appeal over reasoned argument today is found in the radical environmental movement, whose early roots were in German fascism. The historian Anna Branwell, while making the common mistake of conflating conservatism and fascism, nevertheless wrote that greenness was seen as an incipiently sinister conservative or even fascist idea in German thought, going back to Hitler's support of renewable energy to help reduce Germany's dependence on oil in short supply through much of the war. The anti-fossil fuel movement uses the fascist appeal to emotion over reason, demonizing all who dare question it as climate change deniers. Today, the rise of extremism is more pronounced and frightening on the left than the right. The demonization of the right as fascism, that therefore forfeits its place to be heard in the public square, employs the strategy developed by the Marxist scholar Herbert Marcuse. One of the progenitors of the so-called New Left in the 1950s, Marcuse maintained that certain views on the right had to be silenced because this freedom of expression was serving the cause of oppression. In this line of thought, censorship serves the cause of freedom because intolerance against the right, while indulging extremism from the left, somehow levels the playing field for democratic debate. That absurd notion is at last managing to take hold in many academic and media circles today. Philip Cross is the former chief economist at Statistics Canada. Great job, Philip. Like I say, I'm always appreciative to see someone who represents a media outlet such as Post publications and all that entails, putting forth this kind of narrative, because as much as I respect and promote those in the alternative media sphere, I'll also promote and respect those who even come from predominantly the establishment or historical media establishments or publications that do push back against the kind of authoritarian collectivism that seems to be dominating the political discourse and representative of your thought leaders or opinion makers today. Like I say, without people such as Philip here, there'd be a whole large segment of the Canadian population that don't watch YouTube videos, or people such as myself who are in the alternative media landscape or sphere, who would be ignorant and ill-informed and still falling in line and repeating and regurgitating the kind of rhetoric espoused by those who predominantly represent the leftists, the collectivists, the authoritarian collectivists. But like I say, folks, competition of ideas and being adversarial to government is something that still does have a foothold in this country. The importance is for us to maintain and sustain it by supporting them economically. Because if you don't, well, the authoritarian collectivists, the socialists, those who use forced wealth and income redistribution as their business model, well, they're always going to be able to maintain that because, once again, they're the representation of the monopoly of force of violence. And using force as a means to sustain their thought leaders, opinion makers. Well, if we're going to show that voluntarism and voluntary economic interactions and engagements is the best way to do things, then we have to lead by example and put our best foot forward and show how that works in real life. And that means helping to sustain and support those who are giving you those alternative voices, opinions, and narratives out there, whether they come from historical venues or outlets such as the Financial Post or Post Media, or, like I say, those of us who are in the alternative media sphere or social media landscape, such as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Minds, Gabs, or many of the other platforms out there that are readily available to help educate and inform you properly. We have to get to the point where we're not just talking the talk, but we're all walking the walk as well, and leading by example and showing that there's definitely another way to do things. And the voluntary way is always and will be the best way for us to deal with each other socially and economically. Once again, that's another area where personal responsibility is of paramount importance. It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.